Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep again, and this time it's James Monroe's Second Inaugural Address from 1821, right in the thick of the era of good feelings.
Yeah, so, his first inaugural kind of set the stage for that whole period.
Yeah.
But this second one, it's different, it's more forward-looking, almost like he's using this speech to lay the groundwork for America's future, westward expansion, the nation's place in the world, that sort of thing.
And to help us sort through all that, we've got an expert with us for this deep dive. This is Dr. Jareau Almeyda. So let's jump in. It's a long one, right? Over 4,000 words?
4,472 to be exact.
Wow. Almost twice as long as his first inaugural address. What was going on in 1821 that he had so much to say?
Well, think about it. The U.S. population had almost doubled since that first inaugural. It's up to 9.6 million people. That's a lot of growth in just 4 years.
Yeah, huge.
And all that westward expansion, lots of energy, sense of possibility, but also some anxiety about what it all meant for the future of the country.
So, plenty to talk about. We've got Dr. Almeyda's analysis to work with, which includes some really interesting stuff like sentiment analysis, looking at the overall emotional tone, keyword frequencies, all that. Let's start with those keywords. What jumps out at you?
Well, right away you see national and government appearing a lot, much more than in any other inaugural address up to that point. It's like Monroe was really focused on strengthening federal power, maybe even at the expense of states' rights, which was a big debate back then.
So even in the era of good feelings, there's some tension brewing.
Absolutely. And that's where the sentiment analysis gets really interesting. The overall tone is very positive, lots of joy, which makes sense. But Dr. Almeyda also picked up on this undercurrent of anger, especially when Monroe is talking about foreign policy.
Which, of course, is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
And we can't talk about Monroe's second inaugural without talking about that one line that basically became the Monroe Doctrine. Can you unpack that for us a little?
Right.
What was he saying there, and why did it become such a big deal?
Well, it's actually deceptively simple. He basically declared that North and South America were no longer open to colonization by European powers. Like, he drew a line in the sand. Our hemisphere, hands off.
So he's staking a claim for a huge chunk of territory, not just for the U.S. as it was then, but for the whole Western Hemisphere. That's a pretty bold move, especially for a nation that was still figuring itself out. I mean, this is only, what, like 40 years after the Revolution?
A little over 40, yeah.
What kind of impact did this have on American foreign policy?
Huge impact. In a lot of ways, this one statement set the tone for U.S. foreign policy for decades to come. American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, interventions in Latin America, all sorts of things flowed from this one idea.
Wow. It's amazing to think about how one speech can have such a ripple effect through history. This was the last inaugural address where the majority of voters were actually alive during the Revolution, right? They were the founding generation.
That's right.
How do you think this speech landed with them compared to, younger folks who had only ever known an independent America?
Well, you got to imagine for the founding generation, this must have been powerful validation of their sacrifices. They'd fought for independence, for this new kind of nation. And here's Monroe essentially saying, look how far we've come. We're not just surviving, we're thriving. We're ready to take our place on the world stage.
That's a great way to put it. And Dr. Almeyda's analysis really brings out that mix of pride and ambition, but also that undercurrent of anger you were talking about earlier, almost like a warning shot to any foreign power thinking about underestimating America.
Exactly. He's projecting strength, confidence, this sense that the U.S. is not going to be bullied anymore. It's a really fascinating shift from his first inaugural, which was much more about domestic issues, healing divisions after the war, 1812, that sort of thing.
So we're seeing a real evolution in his thinking and how he's positioning the U.S. in relation to the rest of the world. Now, before we move on, I'm curious, from your perspective, what's the most striking thing about this speech? What really jumped out at you from Dr. Almeyda's analysis?
It's how Monroe manages to weave together this sense of historical continuity while simultaneously laying out this incredibly bold vision for the future. He's constantly referencing the legacy of the founding fathers, the principles of the revolution, but he's using that to justify a much more expansive role for the U.S. on the world stage. It's really clever, rhetorically speaking.
It's like he's saying we're staying true to our roots, but we're also evolving, growing, adapting.
Exactly. And that's a message that resonates even today, right? How do we honor our past while embracing the future? It's a question every generation grapples with.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this long, ambitious speech delivered at a time of, national optimism and expansion. We've got these keywords that point to national unity, a stronger federal government. And we've got this sentiment analysis that reveals this mix of joy, anger, and defiance. What does it all mean? What's the big takeaway here?
I think the big takeaway is that Monroe's second inaugural is, well, it's a lot more complex than it seems at first glance. It gives us this really fascinating glimpse into the political landscape of early America, the tensions, ambitions, the anxieties that were swirling around at the time. And it reminds us that even these seemingly simple statements can have profound and lasting consequences, for better or worse.
It's a good reminder that history is never really past. It shapes our present in so many ways. And speaking of the present, this whole idea of American exceptionalism that Monroe articulates so strongly in this speech, it's still debated today, isn't it? How do you think his vision holds up in the 21st century?
That's a great question, and one we could probably spend a whole episode unpacking. But for now, I'll just say this. Monroe's vision was incredibly bold for its time, and it definitely helped shape the trajectory of American power and influence. But it's also a vision that's been challenged and reinterpreted throughout history. And I think ultimately it's up to each generation to decide how they want to carry forward that legacy, what parts to embrace and what parts to question or even reject.
That's a great point. Okay, we've only scratched the surface here. There's so much more to unpack in Monroe's second inaugural. After a quick break, we'll dive deeper into the specifics of Dr. Almeyda's analysis and see what other hidden gems we can uncover.
Sounds good.
Let's take a quick break. Want to equip your child with the skills of top global consultants? Don't let them fall behind. Raising Tomorrow's Leaders, The Consultant's Mindset by Dr. Jareau Almeyda is your guide to fostering essential skills in your children for their lifelong success. Available now on Amazon.
We're back. And I got to say, this whole deep dive into Monroe's second inaugural is really fascinating. It's amazing how much we can learn about history just by looking at the language of a speech.
Absolutely. And Dr. Almeyda's work with, the sentiment analysis and the keyword frequencies, it just adds a whole other layer to it all. Like, one thing that really struck me was the contrast between his first and second inaugural addresses.
Yeah, the first one was way shorter, right?
Almost 1,000 words shorter.
Wow.
And the focus was totally different. The first one, from 1817, it's very inward-looking, talking about, national unity after the War of 1812, economic development, infrastructure projects even, education. It's a very domestic agenda.
And then, bam, 4 years later, he's basically telling Europe to back off the whole Western Hemisphere. That's a huge change. What happened in those 4 years?
Well, a lot happened, actually. The War of 1812, even though it was kind of a mess, it did prove that the U.S. could stand up to a major European power. The economy was taking off, the country was expanding west. All that created this sense of optimism, national confidence, which you can really see reflected in his second inaugural.
Like the U.S. was coming of age as a nation, and Monroe was putting that into words.
Exactly. And the Monroe Doctrine is a perfect example of that. It's this bold statement, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. will see any interference as a threat. Really set the stage for almost 200 years of American dominance in the region.
But wasn't the Monroe Doctrine also about, promoting democracy and self-government in the Americas? Wasn't that part of it too?
Oh, absolutely. That's an important point. Monroe really believed that the American system of government was superior to the monarchies of Europe, and he wanted to see it spread.
So it's both power and principle.
Exactly. Protecting American interests, but also spreading American values. That combination of, pragmatism and idealism has been a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy ever since.
Interesting. Okay, we've talked a lot about the big picture, but I'm curious about some of the smaller details. Dr. Almeyda's analysis highlights some things that you wouldn't find in a, typical textbook. Did you know that in this whole 4,472-word speech, there's only one question mark and one exclamation point?
It's true. You'd think a speech of that length, and importance would have a lot more rhetorical flourishes. But Dr. Almeyda argues that it's actually very deliberate. It reflects Monroe's personality. He was known for being very reserved, thoughtful, analytical, and the speech itself is very focused on conveying information clearly, not trying to stir up emotion or anything.
Like he's laying out a blueprint. He wants to make sure there's no room for misinterpretation.
Right. But even though the tone is very measured and deliberate, there are these moments where the sentiment analysis picks up on these, flashes of emotion. For example, when he's talking about American resilience and the nation's future prospects, there's this noticeable surge in joy.
That's interesting. It suggests that even with all the talk of, foreign policy and national security, he was genuinely optimistic about the future.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He believed the U.S. was on the right track, and that comes through really clearly in the speech.
And that belief, it's been a powerful force throughout American history, for better or for worse.
Okay, another thing Dr. Almeida points out is that Monroe was speaking to this really diverse audience. I mean, there were people voting who had lived through the revolution, right?
Exactly. Dr. Almeida actually identifies three distinct generations in the electorate. You've got the founding generation, they were 55 and older. The Constitution generation, they were between 38 and 54. And the expansion generation, the youngest, 21 to 37. And he argues that Monroe was really aware of this, and he was tailoring his message to appeal to each of them.
Trying to bridge that gap between past and future, acknowledging the legacy of the founders, but also trying to inspire a new generation.
We've inherited this amazing legacy, but now it's our responsibility to build on it.
Take it even further. Yeah. And that's a powerful message that I think still resonates today.
It does. Okay, before we move on, I want to touch on one more thing that jumped out at me from Dr. Almeida's analysis. He talks about how Monroe devotes a lot of the speech, like 15%, to maritime issues. Shipping, naval power, protecting American commerce on the high seas.
Right. And that makes sense when you think about it. The War of 1812 had been fought largely at sea, and the U.S. was really eager to, assert its maritime rights, expand its commercial interests globally. It's kind of ironic, though, when you consider that Monroe himself had no naval experience.
Right. But it shows how important these issues were to the nation at the time. It was about projecting American power on a global scale.
Controlling the seas, which back then was essential for controlling trade, projecting military force.
It's amazing how things change, and yet some things stay the same.
Right.
The details might be different, but the underlying dynamics of power and influence, those are still very much at play today.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why, studying history is so important. It helps us understand the present, gives us this deeper perspective on the past.
Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more thing from Dr. Almeida's analysis that I found really fascinating. He actually delves into the weather conditions on the day of Monroe's second inaugural.
The weather, really? What's so interesting about the weather?
Well, apparently March 4th, 1821, was unusually warm in Washington, D.C., and the speech was delivered outdoors, spring-like conditions. Quite a contrast to his first inaugural, which was delivered on a much colder day.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a small detail, but it actually adds to the whole picture, doesn't it? Almost symbolic of the shift in tone between the two speeches. From, cold, harsh realities of war and internal divisions to this, warmth and optimism of a new era.
Exactly. Even the weather was cooperating with his message of a bright future. And speaking of hope, Dr. Almeida's analysis also points to this very personal touch in the speech. It speaks to Monroe's character and his worldview. He points out that Monroe's wife, Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, had experienced this profound tragedy earlier in her life.
Oh, right. Elizabeth lost her first husband and youngest son to yellow fever back in 1793. A terrible thing.
Yeah. And Dr. Almeida suggests that this might have influenced Monroe's very powerful language when he talks about the horrors of war. There's this one passage where he talks about, the torture and death inflicted on soldiers and civilians alike. Really evocative language. It makes you wonder if he was drawing on his wife's experience, trying to convey the human cost of conflict in a way that would resonate with his audience.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point. It reminds us that even the most powerful figures are shaped by these personal experiences, and those experiences can influence the way they lead, the decisions they make.
It humanizes him, right? Shows that he wasn't just this, distant figurehead. He was a man who understood the costs of conflict on a personal level.
Yeah.
And that probably shaped his commitment to peace, his desire to avoid future wars.
Absolutely. It adds another layer of depth and complexity to his character, to his motivations. It's amazing how much we can learn from just one speech.
It really is. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the contrast between his first and second inaugurals, the significance of the Monroe Doctrine, the diverse audience he was addressing, the importance of maritime issues, even the weather and his personal life. What do you think? What are your big takeaways? What stands out to you about this speech, knowing what we know now about its historical context and its long-term impact?
Well, for me, it's the sheer audacity of his vision. This young nation, barely 50 years old, declaring its dominance over an entire hemisphere. It speaks to the incredible optimism and ambition that, characterized America in the early 19th century.
It's like, we're here, we're powerful, and we're not afraid to say so.
Exactly. And it reminds us that even simple statements like the Monroe Doctrine can have these huge ripple effects through history.
It's amazing that one paragraph in this speech shaped U.S. foreign policy for, well, for centuries, really.
The Monroe Doctrine is still cited today,
No.
maybe in a more nuanced form, but still. It's a testament to the power of language.
Yeah. Another takeaway for me is the importance of understanding context. We can't really understand this speech without considering the historical moment, the aftermath of the War of 1812, the westward expansion, the era of good feelings. All those things shaped Monroe's message and how people received it.
And that's where Dr. Almeyda's work has been so helpful. The sentiment analysis, the keyword frequencies, the historical correlations, it's all helped us appreciate the nuances of this speech.
It's like we've been able to, eavesdrop on a conversation that happened over 200 years ago.
A conversation that's still relevant in a lot of ways. It's a reminder that the past isn't really past. It shapes us in ways that we may not even realize.
For me, the biggest takeaway is that Monroe's Second Inaugural is so much more than just a dusty old document. It's full of these surprisingly relevant ideas about America's role in the world, the balance of power between the federal government and the states, the challenges of navigating a world that's changing so rapidly.
Exactly. It deserves to be revisited, reinterpreted in light of everything that's going on today.
So to all our listeners out there, if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out the full text of the speech. It's online, easy to find, and definitely check out Dr. Almeyda's work on political rhetoric. It's fascinating.
One final thought. Monroe's vision was bold and ambitious, but the U.S. was still relatively young and fragile. Was he right to be so confident? And how do his ideas about expansion, foreign policy, national unity, how do those hold up today? I think those are questions worth thinking about as we face our own challenges in the 21st century.
That's a great point. Until next time, keep diving deep. Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into James Monroe's Second Inaugural Address. I always find it amazing how these speeches from, hundreds of years ago can still feel so relevant.
It's true. And I think that's especially true with this one. Monroe was dealing with issues that, in many ways are still with us today. How to balance national interests with global responsibilities, how to manage a rapidly changing world.
Right. So as we kind of bring this all together, what are your big takeaways? What stands out to you?
I think for me, the thing that's most striking is how carefully crafted this speech is. Like we talked about the sentiment analysis and the keyword frequencies, and it's clear that Monroe really put a lot of thought into every word, every phrase.
He wasn't just, winging it up there.
No, definitely not. He had a very specific message he wanted to convey, and he did it masterfully. Think about the way he uses language to connect the past with the future. He's constantly invoking the legacy of the Founding Fathers, the principles of the Revolution, but he's doing it in a way that, propels the nation forward. He's not stuck in the past. He's using it as a foundation to build on.
It's like he's saying, hey, we've come this far, but we're not done yet. We've got even greater things to achieve.
Exactly. And that's a message that I think has resonated with Americans throughout history. It's this idea that, we're a nation on a journey and we're always striving to be better, to do more, to reach higher.
And he's not afraid to be bold, is he? I mean, the Monroe Doctrine is a pretty audacious statement, basically drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is our hemisphere, hands off.
Right. And at a time when the U.S. was still a relatively new and, untested power, that took some guts.
It did. But I guess that's part of what makes this speech so compelling. It's this combination of, idealism and pragmatism. He's laying out this vision of a, free and independent America, but he's also backing it up with realpolitik. He's saying, we're going to stand up for our interests and we're not going to back down.
And that's something that I think we can still learn from today. The world is a complex place. There are a lot of competing interests out there, but it's important to have a clear sense of who we are, what we stand for, and what we're willing to fight for.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the speech itself, but I also want to circle back to Dr. Almeyda's analysis. What did you find most insightful about his approach?
I really appreciate how he brings in all these different layers of analysis, the sentiment analysis, the keyword frequencies, the historical correlations. It's also fascinating. And it helps us to understand, not just what Monroe was saying, but how he was saying it, the emotional undercurrents, the rhetorical strategies he was using to persuade his audience. It's like getting a behind-the-scenes look at how history is made.
Right. And it reminds us that these speeches, they're not just words on a page. They were delivered by real people in real time. to real audiences.
Yeah.
And they had real consequences.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. It's not just about learning facts and dates. It's about, stepping back in time and trying to understand the complexities of the past, the challenges, the hopes, the fears that shape the world we live in today.
And ultimately, I think that's what makes history so fascinating. It's a mirror that we can hold up to ourselves.
Yeah.
It helps us to see, not just where we've been, but where we might be going.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to thank you again for joining us and sharing your insights. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well.
And to our listeners out there, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into James Monroe's Second Inaugural Address. It's a speech that, might seem like ancient history, but it's full of timeless wisdom and insights that are still relevant today. So if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out the full text of the speech. It's readily available online. And of course, be sure to check out Dr. Almeyda's work. He's got some amazing insights into how language shapes our understanding of the world. Until next time, keep diving deep, everybody.